Hello and welcome everyone to the demo debate. Do I have OG here?
Yes, and I think my partner is also here. Yeah, he's here.
Yeah.
Nice. OO?
Yep.
Yep, we're here.
Cool. And without any further ado, I'd like to invite Prime Minister here.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. I'll start then in 3, 2, 1. Our stance is clear. We think that the war on drugs is an unmitigated failure, and we think the way that we can go about solving this issue is through legalization, through regulation, and through combating these cartels in that way. That's going to be what our mechanism is. So we're going to legalize all drugs, but we're going to have things like minimum safety laws to for the workers themselves to ensure they're treated well, like any other industry. We're going to have safety regulations like on these drugs. We're going to tax them. We're going to only let them be sold to over 18-year-olds, all that sort of thing. The standard sort of model that you'd have for legalizing drugs. I think so. Yeah, and it's going to be all drugs as the motion suggests. In terms of what we think Colombia's interests are then, I think the first thing is to diminish this power that these individual cartels have because they're quite violent and obviously these criminal entities, and also to ensure the government gets better revenue, people within Colombia are generally better off, and so on. I think that's generally what we ought to weigh in this debate. So why do we think that a few things in this speech then? Firstly, in terms of explaining why these cartels actually formalize as a result of this and you get a lot more competition in the drug market. Secondly, explaining specifically in terms of the people who are forced into working into this drug industry, why they're helped a lot by this motion. And finally, looking at the demand side impacts, like how the government revenue is helped, why drugs get safer, and so on. Okay, why do we think cartels have an incentive to actually formalize and follow all of these regulations rather than kind of remaining submerged in the black market? I think there are 4 mechanisms here. Firstly, I think there's loads of legal protections that you get as a result of formalization. So things like you can actually take your sellers or something to court if necessary to ensure that your things are sold in that correct fashion. Secondly, I think really obviously, it just means you get loads of saved costs, right? Obviously now when it's legalized, you don't have to spend loads of money if you're a drug cartel on things like bribing politicians or things like maintaining these massive underground supply networks. And those things necessarily change as a result of this motion. You can get a massive saving there. You don't have to spend all that stuff. Thirdly, though, I think it's the specific context in which Colombia operates right now. And I say that we think that drug cartels are at a uniquely vulnerable stage, especially since the signing of the peace deal with FARC, which is one of their key supporters, which means that as a result of this, these drug cartels kind of want as much revenue as possible. They don't want to be hounded by the police to the same extent. And so as a result of this, they're more willing to formalize in this way. But also, we think that at the point at which you legalize, you're likely to get new entrants into this market. So it's not just going to be the drug cartels having this monopoly power in terms of this production of cocoa. Because the specific reason why the drug cartels exist is not on the production side, but rather the fact that these cartels are the only specific group that actually safely transport these drugs to market, like they have the underground networks, etc. That changes now, and you get rid of that barrier to entry. All that you need to actually successfully produce drugs is have the specific chemicals that you need to produce those drugs, which means it's a lot easier for newer firms to actually enter this market, and it's no longer monopoly control by these cartels. I think this has a bunch of important impacts as a result of this. I think firstly, it means that you get a higher quality of drugs, partly because, as I mentioned in my mechanism, we're going to have a basic level of safety to ensure that all these drugs are quite safe. But also more importantly, insofar as this market becomes a lot more competitive now, because the cartels aren't the unique people who can produce these drugs anymore, I think that means that you get a competitive mechanism which ensures that the safety of these drugs is ensured, because obviously consumers won't want to buy unsafe drugs as a result of this. So I think that means that actually you get just in general a bunch of safer drugs, and actually these cartels are going to join the market rather than remaining in a black market or something, as opposition might suggest. I think this has a bunch of impacts in terms of the supply side and the farmers, etc. as well. Because recognize that often, I'll take OG at 5 or 6. I think oftentimes lots of people in Colombia are forced into working into the drug market, even if they don't necessarily want to. The reason for that is really simple. In a lot of areas, cartels often act as a proxy government because the government itself has kind of quite little oversight. So they're literally the only choice of employer. But also the fact that drugs, if you're a farmer, for instance, growing the cocoa plant and making cocaine in this way often pays a lot higher than just the other alternatives that you necessarily have as a result of this. I think what that means is that the cartels have massive power over these particular farmers because they're literally the only viable employer that they have as a result of this. And this is a massive group within Colombia itself. I think as a result of this motion, these people's lives are helped in a number of respects. Firstly, I think what it means is that because of the reason for competition that I outlined earlier, namely the fact that many different firms can enter, oftentimes these firms could like compete for these workers rather than it just being one firm and them being able to pay these workers whatever they want and like oppress them in that particular way. So you can like compete to ensure that you're getting the best cocoa product coming in. But also secondly, these farmers don't have to live in constant fear of the US funded police coming in, like beating them up or just massively harming them in these particular ways. Rather, given that it's now legal, I think what happens is that these farmers can own these other groups of people can live a lot more safely without knowing that they're going to be in jail for mass amounts of time just for the sake of their own survival. I think we really ought to weigh this group, partly because it's a massive like constituent part of Colombia itself, but also the fact that like insofar as Colombia doesn't want kind of like political instability as a result of these people being a lot worse, that's probably something that we ought to weigh too. Before I go on, I'll take Jess. Yeah, go.
Yeah, can you explain to me how you make heroin safe?
Well, you can do things like for example, ensure that like the heroin is less diluted or something with other potentially dodgy chemicals. I know Ala's like the more biological expert, she can tell you, but I think that's kind of my basic understanding of it. So yeah, the other reason why this specific group is really important is because oftentimes they form political distance. So groups like FARC, for instance, were made up primarily of these like farming groups. And I think that as a result of formalization, these people have less of a grievance towards the government and actually less of an incentive as a result of this. But also, we think you get a bunch of benefits like for the government itself and for actually dealing with the problem of drugs in the longer term. Obviously, the government gets a lot of revenue as a result of selling these particular drugs and putting taxes on production and so on. And I think what that means is that that money can then specifically go into things like, for instance, drug rehab. So insofar as this problem of addiction to drugs is one that exists on both sides of the house, we probably get more of a path to solvency, given that these governments can then allocate this money in terms of things that actually help these people rather than just constantly funding it into the police in a futile attempt to try and crush out demand for drugs that will always continue to exist. But also, I think you can, as the government, put less money into things like, you know, police, etc., which have a massive opportunity cost. Like, because as Colombia, you're forced to, you know, ban these drugs as a result of this. I think that means you have to spend a lot on enforcement, which that money no longer is necessary on our side of the house. The final thing is that Latin America in general has a trend towards legalization. So Colombia not being the only actor that doesn't actually legalize is going to be quite bad because these other countries are still going to produce drugs and they're going to come to Colombia. So the supply of illegal drugs is going to increase as a result. I think at the end of this, it's pretty clear. The key groups in this debate on the supply and demand side are massively helped by legalization. I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for your fine speech, and I'd like to invite leader of opposition to continue the debate here.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool. Then I'm going to be starting in 3, 2, 1. Well, speaker, what I'll do in my speech is pretty simple. I'll do two things. First of all, I'll explain why violence is not going to stop in case we apply this motion. And secondly, I'm going to explain why it's going to be an international relations disaster for Colombia that's going to put it under sanctions and it's going to be extremely problematic for its already crippled economy. For that, a few points of response to opening government. So what opening government gives to us is a lot of reasons as to why cartels are going to accept this deal and legalize their drug production. And, you know, we're not going to worry about that. We agree, there's a lot of reasons for them to do so. However, we must understand that cartels are not only groups that produce drugs. They have a ton of other businesses that are also incredibly profitable towards them. All of those businesses are still going to remain illegal, and I'll explain further in my speech why exactly these businesses are still going to require a lot of violence, a lot of trouble with police, and therefore why the situation is not going to majorly change for most of the Colombians. The second thing that they talk about is that cartels have power over farmers, and we're going to improve the capabilities for farmers to, you know, pursue their lives, basically. First of all, what they say is that they're going to be able to compete fairly with each other, get better conditions, etc. We don't really believe in that. We don't believe that there's some kind of union system of farmers right now in Colombia that's going to be able to function correctly. There is no very much coherent political well-functioning political system in Colombia at the moment, given the situation with FARC and all other groups. I believe the fastest way for you to get farmers to work for you is for you to bribe some politicians to make you an exclusive representative in this area or something like that as a cartel. Given that you have a ton of money to do so, and given that politicians are easily bribable, it's likely that you're not going to try and outcompete other cartels to get yourself best farmers, but try and work with politicians, etc., in order to get yourself best conditions. But secondly, when they talk about that, farmers are just going to be able to live without fear of raids and jail and etc., I believe we can do that on both sides, because it does not necessarily entail legalization of all drugs, right? We can decriminalize drugs, which means that we're not going to lock up users of it, or we're not going to lock up small level like dealers, or maybe even farmers themselves. Instead of wasting resources on that, which is incredibly wasteful and problematic, we're going to take resources that we used when we spent that on this full-scale war, and instead of that, try to target top-level targets in those cartels, their leaders, their top dogs, which is going to be, in our opinion, still something that's going to pressure these cartels pretty well, and it is something that we're able to do if we're going to distribute our resources, as I just explained, which is still not going to harm farmers if we just take away, for example, their produce that's illegally made and things like that, and if we allow them to grow marijuana and things like that as they do in status quo. So then, why we're standing against this motion? Let's first talk about cartels, other businesses. So we must understand, drugs are only one part of what cartels do, but there's a lot of other stuff. There's sex trafficking businesses. There's money laundering operations that they run for businesses and politicians from Colombia and from other countries. There are kidnappings. There are like organ sales, etc., etc., a ton of other criminal activities that they engage in, and all of those criminal activities are incredibly profitable revenue streams towards them, with tens of billions of dollars in collection of money. Even if drugs are the most profitable out of them, it is still a giant industry, and it's incredibly unlikely that those cartels are just going to give away billions of dollars that they may potentially earn every month just in order to legalize themselves fully. What we believe is most likely to happen is that, sure, they're going to legalize their drug dealing side of businesses. They're going to kind of branch out, say that this part of business now separate from the cartel, etc. However, we believe that it still doesn't mean that the other parts of the cartel are stopping to function, which means that there's still going to be a ton of violence, as you still have to stop all of these parts of cartels that are continuing to thrive. We believe that they're likely to continue thriving because of two reasons. First of all, because it's unlikely that the Colombian government is going to be able to trace money streams within its country, given how incompetent its response has been so far to all of these problems, and therefore all of those businesses are going to be able to be funded by this legal money that's now being gained by cartels. But secondly, because these cartels cannot afford to give up their arms, because they are in competition with other cartels on the borders, cartels from Venezuela, etc., but also just because they already have all of those arms at hand, so they have a unique opportunity in order to pursue all of those illegal businesses, and no one else can just basically compete with them in that niche, which means it's incredibly profitable for them, so they have a lot of incentives to do so. Why is that problematic? Because the main goal of this motion is to stop violence, but it doesn't really stop. There's a lot of violence still ongoing as you try to pursue all of those problems. However, what you also have is that you have a ton of unrestricted hard drugs circulating in society. And we're not talking about marijuana, right? We're talking about heroin, we're talking about meth, we're talking about whatnot other hard drugs. The problem with these drugs is that even if you don't dilute them, sure, they don't kill you as fast. However, they still create extremely crippling addiction to themselves, which absolutely destroys your ability to reason for yourself, as the level of addiction is so damaging to your physique that everyone basically knows what is addiction to heroin, right? You cannot just basically do anything else other than seek it for another dose if you're having all of those bad addiction effects, which is something that just cripples the ability of people to make their own independent choices. And it is something that makes humans, right? Which is incredibly problematic. Before I'll continue with this, I'll take opening out.
So let me be clear. You do not want to legalize drugs, because not every single problem in Colombia will be solved by that, right?
I would basically say that it's not every single problem. I would say no problems are basically solved because of the fact that violence is still going to continue in the same degree, basically, because all of you still have to do police raids on the same basis of those cartels. You still have to fight the same leaders of those cartels, etc., which means that there is like only change that you're doing is that you have more drug addicted people inside of your country, which is incredibly problematic. But then what is the second problematic thing with an international response? This is an action that's going to be uncoordinated with your neighbors such as Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, etc., but also with the United States, which means that you are essentially turning your country into a safe haven for cartels where they can freely operate, create as many drugs as they want, sell them quite easily, smuggling them throughout the border to every other country, which means that your country is essentially now a drug dealer for the entirety of the region. Most of the region doesn't want that. It hates the idea that there's going to be so much drugs circulating on their own internal markets, especially the United States is going to hate that, and it's unlikely that they're going to take this lightly. It's most probably that the most probable fact is that they're going to try to pressure you out of this policy, and the only pressure that they can do to you is probably through economic sanctions and things like that. Given your economy is already in big trouble as Colombia, it's not something that you want to do. Because of that, please oppose this motion.
Thank you very much for your fine speech, and I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Can you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Okay, just let me set up my timer. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So I do think that opposition lives in a very interesting world. First of all, they live in a world where every single one of you would really like to try heroin and would really like to, if it was legal, you would just go to the shop, buy heroin and put it in your arm and like get addicted immediately. Second of all, I do think that opposition also lives in a world when in a moment in which you cannot solve every single problem with violence that exists in Colombia, well, there is no point. The world in which Colombia lives in is a world in which around, I think, like a few hundreds of thousands of people, like I think around 300,000 people in Colombia are involved within a drug market. This is a huge number of people that right now is being prosecuted to an extreme degree, that cannot operate legal, and that is being forced by cartels and first of all by their own government to do things that are illegal. We do believe that the only way to solve this problem and to actually give those people a real chance in pursuing what they want to pursue in life and a real chance of not fearing any persecution, etc., is to legalize all drugs. First of all, a little bit to what Mukhtar said. First of all, he says that it's not really sure if those farmers are going to be able to compete fairly. There's no union of farmers or whatever. At the point at which Aniket proves to you that if this market is legalized and you can legally operate, this means that there is probably a bigger chance of new companies entering the market and trying to fight for market shares, right? For getting some kind of this market, to not monopolize it. There are also anti-monopolization laws applies at this place, etc., right? Which means that as a farmer that is selling cocaine, it is probably much more easy for you to get fair competition in a world in which this is legalized, right? Because only then you can actually search for the best. You have options to search for the best option for you, right? Only in this world this is possible for you. In any other world, basically someone comes to you, put the gun in your head, and you have to do it, and you cannot tell anyone about that because it's what you're doing. It's illegal. Why then they say decriminalizing is enough? Why decriminalizing is not enough? Decriminalizing is just allowing you to have some drugs for your own recreational like things. If you are like having a field of coca that you're selling to a drug market, this is probably not decriminalizing that. Even if you're only decriminalizing, not legalizing, this means that loads of things do not apply to you. That is, what not applies to you is workers' protection. What not applies to you is some legal protection that you can have against monopoly, against whatever against someone that's treating you unfairly, right? You do not pay for your health insurance or whatever via the government, because what you're doing is maybe decriminalized. Like you can do whatever you want with your coca, but you cannot probably legally sell them, right? For all of those reasons, it's not true that decriminalizing is enough. what they say is that what they sell is also that there is still a lot of criminal activities going on, other profitable revenue streams like not drug dealing side of business, like, I don't know, human trafficking or whatever. Listen, Annika explained to you, right, that this is a huge business. I tell you, 300,000 of people in Colombia are in some way involved in drug market. This means that those people, those people has been failed by their own government. Their own government for 30 or 40 years has been fighting with them, has been trying to any means that they possibly could have tried to give them a better life. They still don't have any other options. Like on the fields, growing bananas or whatever is not profitable enough, right? When you're living in slums, you have no other option than probably go to a cartel and be in a cartel and sell and do drugs, right? At the point at which we legalize them, this means that your son, who has no other option than do drugs because otherwise he's not able to support his family and you, suddenly is not thrown in jail for X amount of years and going out of this jail even more connected to this cartel, right? People are thrown in jail for selling or for dealing drugs, and then they're going out of this jail because let's face it, Colombia doesn't have an amazing rehabilitation system. Then they are going out of this jail as people with problems, as people who are even more connected to the cartels that they have been before, right? What opposition is telling you, oh, this is not such a huge problem. There are people who are involved in other side of cartels. Listen, 300,000 people that we are able to help on our side of the house, their side of the house, have literally no other option for them, right? Government has failed those people. Those people have to go to cartels. They are going to cartels. They are selling drugs, and then they are put in jail and going out even more connected to cartels. I'm listening, Mukhtar.
As I said, we may not throw farmers in jail. Can you engage this alternative instead of the alternative that you're trying to push upon us that we don't agree with?
I've already told you that decriminalizing doesn't solve all of the problems. It means that you're still operating illegal, at least in some ways when selling, for example, because selling is still illegal, right? It means that you're not paying taxes. It means that you're not paying for your health insurance. It means that you do not have competition and you have to go to this one cartel that comes to you. Like there's so many problems that I already explained to you at the beginning. Finally, to engage with this point that everyone is going to suddenly try heroin and it's so bad to get addicted. We agree with that. It's bad to get addicted, right? But it's not like everyone is gonna try heroin or whatever. On our side of the house, those drugs are cleaner because they go through some safety regulation. On our side of the house, you can sell legal, like small doses that those, for example, like make small doses only sellable so people do not like overuse at once. At our side of the house, right? Those people can go to a doctor and admit that they're using drugs, etc. And finally, it's not like literally everyone wants to try hard heroin or whatever. Most people want to try marijuana, maybe MDMA, maybe ecstasy, maybe some like drugs. Most people do not really want to go out and try cocaine. So I don't really buy their explanation that everyone is going to be addicted because people will try cocaine or try heroin. Even if they will try, they're still a long way from trying once an addiction. And believe me, most of you don't want to try heroin, and most of you would never try heroin, even if it was legal. For all of those reasons, really, it's not going to be as OO is painting this world for you. For all of these reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you very much for your fine speech, and I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the debate. Here.
You can hear me fine?
Yeah.
Awesome. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The government misunderstands our point. This is not about saying that we can't solve all problems and therefore we won't do anything. This is about pointing out that gangs will still exist because they have operations in a myriad of other things, and therefore you do not get any change on that front. If anything, you just give them now a more sustained revenue source for them to be able to enact their illegal activities in the 7 other spheres which we name and do not get a response to. So what I'm going to do in this speech is firstly look at what some framing in terms of what we think the pathway to success looks like on our side, then engage with what we think are the harms of this policy before responding to the main claims of the government case. Firstly, in terms of framing, the first observation I want to make is that I don't think we necessarily have to prove we get a perfect solution to the drug war, only that their policy makes it infinitely worse. But secondly, we actually do think we are able to, at the very least, make some small gains on our side through things like decriminalization. Whilst it is not like a policy that will solve every problem, it does go some of the way by doing firstly, like not treating people who have genuine addictions as criminals. So we are able to look at those policies and are able to treat them somewhat. But secondly, we can actually do things like not focus police resources on those low-level drug dealers or people who are like simply, just consuming that drug, but actually focus on supply chains and where those issues are most pervasive. We also do not have to stand by like people who have been coerced into this industry, having disproportionate punishments on them. We can also do things like, do plea bargains so that they can like necessarily give evidence on those people which they work for. Like there are a myriad of things that we can utilize at our disposal that do not involve supporting what opposition says we do. So let's look at like some of the harms in this debate. And the first thing they say is that we are able to disrupt these gangs through two mechanisms. The first is that we incentivize them to come into the legal sphere of the drug market because they're afforded legal protections. I'm not sure if this will always be the case for the reason that obviously complying with regulation is extremely costly. There are natural incentives to stay in the illegal drug market for the reason that you have lower compliance costs. And given that they've been able to do this to date, they will probably continue to do this. Secondly, though, in terms of competition, I just am unclear why you're going to get all these new players propping up in the drug market when those cartels are so dominant and so established. Apparently, they're going to be able to like institute anti-monopoly laws in Colombia. Like, I'm not exactly sure how they're going to be able to do that if the existing cartels that exist are constantly bribing politicians. But let's assume you do not believe any of that. Let's assume that you believe that these gangs will fully opt into this market and they will make the most of the legal drug trade, right? Even if that is the case, this policy is still ineffective for the reason we identify, which is you now incentivize them to legalize what is but a very, very small proportion of their business, because they engage, like, these cartels are often multifaceted. They have a gun trade, they have like trafficking, they have like money laundering, all those other things are things that they still engage with. What that means is you do very little to actually disrupt the gang violence that these gangs enact in this part of the world. But also, if anything, you actually make it worse, because if it is true in their best case that then they now engage with the legal drug trade, you're now just giving them an increased revenue source by which they can fund their other illegal activities. And they would be able to very easily do that by simply distributing money. And that would be very difficult for governments to track. Note that that gets no response from opposition. So I assume that that logic broadly stands. So that is a harm in which we claim it gets worse on our side. But we also explain that internationally, this is likely to have detrimental effects for the reason that other countries are unlikely to be in step with this policy. The US would fucking hate this policy. Other Latin American countries would probably also take issue for the reasons we explain, which again get no response, for the reason that you're establishing a safe haven by which drugs can then more easily flow into those other countries. And their main claim here is that actually, no, you're in step with other countries. Other countries are moving down this trajectory. No, they are not. Countries like Argentina, like Mexico, like Chile have decriminalized some drugs, but they have not legalized those drugs. That is the fundamental difference. You will be out of step here. In the worst case scenario, that probably means things like sanctions from the United States. In the best case scenario, that means worsened diplomatic relations with those countries, less incentive to give aid to Colombia to help the very farmers that they care about. Let's look at the last harm here, though, which is the harm of drugs. What we explain to you is that this is not just marijuana we're talking about. We are talking about methamphetamines, like heroin, like extremely destructive and damaging drugs. And these have twofold consequence. The first is that people probably just principally cannot consent to these drugs to the extent that they have hugely addictive qualities. Secondly, they often cause just hugely irreparable harm. Now, government's main contention here is just that we are able to regulate the worst of these drugs by making them a little bit more diluted. And that is probably true. Someone is probably less likely to now on their side, I will concede, overdose on something like ecstasy. But you cannot change the inherent structure of some of these drugs. You are not able to make heroin less addictive. You are not able to make methamphetamines less addictive. That harm still exists. I'll take your POI in just a sec. Their main response is like, but not everyone's going to go out and want to do heroin now. Like, why not? You've just fucking said it is legal. Go nuts. Like, the government is saying that these drugs are fine to consume. It seems intuitive that more people would do this. Yes, opening government.
If the government uses this tax revenue to, for example, have rehabilitation camps or things like education programs on the harms of drugs, why would people massively consume more on your side?
Because it is now legal and you can do so without consequence. The difference between decriminalization, whilst decriminalization, you don't have the same criminal penalty, there's a difference in signaling, which is the government being like, this is fine, go do this thing. I think that's the key distinction. Let's finally look at farmers. Their big thing is farmers are poor and they're screwed under the status quo. 5 responses to this. Firstly, that analysis is contingent on breaking down gangs, which we've proven to you does not change. Secondly, as we've already said, we do not have to throw the lowest level workers in jail. We can have reasonable policies that deal with that. Thirdly, they don't actually give you an incentive as to why these workers will be suddenly treated brilliantly under their side. Fourthly, if you decrease things like foreign aid because you screw international actors, you're less likely to have policies and funding that help that very stakeholder in the first place. And fifthly, I just think it would be bad for governments to discharge their burden by being like, your life is fine now, you can just work for a drug company, rather than actually taking care of that very vulnerable group that government rightly identifies. For those reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, everyone, for very enjoyable debate.